you very much. This has been so provocative. It feels like something I've been waiting for 30 years. I'm dismayed I didn't know about this literature. I want to invite, I am impressed that you made this entire lecture without engaging in any gesturing to gender, though it's the subtext for the whole commentary, it seems to me, and I appreciate that. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on recent developments. When you talk about institutions must be held accountable to this second kind of dependency. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the last 30 years, 50 years even, in changes in marital laws, whether it's the no-fault divorce of the 1970s, and including gay marriage, the effect of gay marriage on this second kind of, I can't remember, second kind of dependency. Derivative dependency. Because it seems to me there are few people as dependent in our society as the pregnant woman.
Okay. Yes.
That's where I'll be.
Well, I actually did reference gender when I talked about the derivative dependent being socially constructed and fashioning social roles of mother.
Yes, you did.
So I did mention
yes,
it. And it is true that this vulnerability arises from all the work that I did with feminist theory. But I really left gender behind, importantly and significantly, and did so when I realized, as I did partway through the evolution of my that it wasn't the gender of the caretaker that really mattered. It was the fact of caretaking itself, that was not valued. And that in fact, you could have as many reforms to gain gender equality as you'd like in the family. But until the other societal institutions were correspondingly reformed in ways that allow people to do both care work and paid work, until that happened, then any notion of gender equality was just formal. It wasn't ever going to be actually realized. So it was that realization that also helped me to see how in so many ways our way of organizing social critique and progressive politics around these identities, whether they be gender, race, disability, sexuality, whatever they be, that they are inadequate and limited ways to approach social problems. So if the problem is poverty, poverty transcends those categories. And if we only focus on those categories, it limits our understanding of the problem, and it limits the possibility of the kinds of solutions that we look to. So we look to anti-discrimination. And for me, I came to the point where I said, you know, what's the point of having, if somebody have anti-discrimination, which means that you can treat everybody badly as long as you treat everybody the same, right? So why don't we worry about the institutions that we're trying to gain access to, how they're actually functioning, which again leads me to these social arrangements and the social identities and the intersection of those social identities. So how is being an employee, how are you disadvantaged vis-a-vis your employer, but also disadvantaged when you have a social role as parent? You know, there's disadvantage. Should the state be caring about those? Should the state be responding to those sorts of situations? So I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does, and there are many other aspects there. I wondered, if I may, just one follow-up. Can we take marriage as one of those institutions that the state should be exercising some concern about in the ways that you described?
It has. And in fact, I would use marriage. I tried to develop this a little bit in the beginning here, but I really just started to think about that. I think it's a really interesting question, why marriage as an institution has been transformed in law. Around the notion used to be whoever earns the money owns the property. And that was what governed divorce and all sorts of other things in gender relationships. But we effectively critiqued that and transformed the law into a partnership model for marriage, with contribution being the fundamental concept. So the notion that the contributions are different, but they're equally valued. Now, why haven't we done that with the workplace? So that the contributions of employees are different, but equally valued with the contributions of capital. You know, so why don't we think about what that means? instead of having employees be just on the accounting form a debit, right, a liability. Why not think about them productively and the state operating to ensure a more just allocation of the benefits of productivity as between employer and employee, as they do in many European states where the state is in fact a partner to the employment contract. It even helps to negotiate the employment contract. So, like, these are not like crazy wild ideas. They're just I'm just trying to do this in the context of you know, an American sensibility.
Hi, thank you so much for your work and your contributions and your talk here. I have sort of a two-part question. So the first part is, you make a dichotomy in your work between vulnerability and autonomy. And I know there's been a little bit of pushback from folks like Katrina McKenzie, right, about the idea that that only works if you buy into a liberal or libertarian view of autonomy. But what about a relational view of autonomy? I mean, she says you kind of hint at that, but you don't really define that. And the second part, like the reason I'm asking for that is I've been exploring the kind of social and intersubjective aspects of vulnerability. And so if we are socially constituted, and which I think you pointed to, we have a need for others, that implies that there are certain forms of vulnerability we can't or shouldn't get rid of.
Oh,
right?
No.
And so this relational autonomy kind of thing, because I've been exploring the way mutual vulnerability may function to enable social cohesion, the bridging of racial and socioeconomic difference. So I'm just curious, I mean, it's not legal and institutional so much, but if you have a response to the first part.
Right. Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, but this is great because you've obviously been reading on vulnerability, so I'm very excited about that. That's a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about. But the notion of relational autonomy, that's so far after where I start. And again, this is the significance of my earlier work, realizing that I had entered the discussion too late. And I really needed to go back to the fundamental foundational concept of vulnerability. And again, we won't get rid of that vulnerability. It is inevitable, constant, universal throughout our lifetime. That is a theoretically extremely important point. Where autonomy and that vulnerability exists there. You can gain autonomy. You can gain the resources that give you the autonomy or the options to deal with that vulnerability in certain ways. But you were not born with that. You have to gain that through social institutions, through relationships. And what we have to do is to pay attention to those institutions and relationships and make sure that they're providing individuals with the resilience, with the resources, so that they can act in what is considered to be an autonomous manner, whether it's labeled relational autonomy or liberal autonomy. But you know, this notion of relational autonomy, and I read that, are you a philosophy major?
Sociology.
I read that book out of Australia, and they get it all. I mean, they don't address that point, it seems to me. So, and I think it's really, really important. So vulnerability, the notion of vulnerability can or shouldn't be erased. It cannot be erased. I mean, we know this intuitively and experientially. There is no position of invulnerability. It does not exist. And we don't talk about more or less vulnerability. We talk about more or less resilience, or we can talk about proximity to the realization of vulnerability, to dependency. We can talk about possibility, likelihood, being at risk. But the vulnerability remains constant, and it's a theoretically very important point, because it's the universal that upon which the claim for state responsibility is built. But we can talk later.
Actually, I want to follow up on just that point, and thank you so much for the talk. And one of the things I've been struggling with is this notion of the constancy and the universality of vulnerability. But, you know, you've got me completely persuaded, except that even as it's true that as embodied creatures we're vulnerable in all kinds of ways, I wonder whether, for the purposes you're trying to serve, that the emphasis on the constancy or the universality of vulnerability disguises the degree to which the state and other institutions produce forms of vulnerability. that is to see it as a kind of a natural condition, seems to me that it's doing something other than producing inequalities of resilience. And so it seems that that if we're thinking about binary cares, that the care that I would put with vulnerability is not invulnerability, but something like predatory behavior in some senses. So does that make sense? So then I wonder whether that kind of universality makes us harder to get at. Think about Hurricane Katrina. That you have a population of women, predominantly poor women of color, who were not, whose situation was produced historically and socially.
So what I would say is that is not the state production of vulnerability, but it's the result of the state's failure to respond to vulnerability or respond unevenly to universal vulnerability. So that, and you can see this, so the state did not, in fact, it was quite interesting because we had Walmart delivering water, right, in Katrina. So what steps in when the state, when we don't have a responsive state? Well, one of the things that steps in are private corporation. But there's other things like gangs that step in too, all sorts of things that step in. But I would not say that that's the production of vulnerability. That is the failure to respond to vulnerability. Again, and I really insist on this for theoretical reasons, that the vulnerability is universal and constant. So the vulnerability of the people who was exposed for some people in Katrina is no different than the vulnerability you and I would have if we were located in the eye of a hurricane. But they had different resources. The state had not responded. They lived in situations, they lived in neighborhoods, responsive of the first responders, some of that, all of that. But that's a failure of state response to vulnerability. That's not the production of vulnerability.
So I just love how you use the life courses in your work on dependency now on vulnerability. But I wonder if you can think a little bit about how the state uses chronological age as a proxy for recognizing physical vulnerability. Because to take Medicaid at 65, you suddenly have a secure claim to state support, but not before. Are you thinking through age at all?
Yeah, I actually have a piece, I have about 10 pieces written on vulnerability so far, and they're always writing more. But there's one, the elderly is vulnerable. And it's quite interesting because, of course, the things that are targeted, and this is the problem with the creation of vulnerable populations, right? They're both over and under inclusive.
Yes.
So, and I point that out. The Commission on Elder Adults, I think it's called in Canada, because we have to have the politically correct terms, not elderly, but older adults, in Canada, actually used the vulnerability theory up to a point. And then, quite interestingly, they got really concerned because they worried about being paternalistic. They worried about, and this is the autonomy point, right? Well, we can't treat the elder adult as though they might have trouble making decisions or their capacity would be compromised, because that would be, so they would abandon them to danger. They would abandon them to harm because they didn't want to compromise the notion of their autonomy. And it's quite a really interesting, I'll be glad to send it to you. It's quite an interesting thing that went on with the Commission. And there's a number of other people that are looking at it in the context of the elderly. I also did a piece on LGBT youth, which was the other end of that, and that really addressed the universality of bullying and the role of institutional responsibility, not only for LGBT youth, but for vulnerable subject as a child, and a vulnerable subject within the geography of public institutions like schools.
So, two sort of generalizing questions that do come from philosophy background. So forgive me if it's clueless about the law background, it may well be. But so on the side of the individual, I just wondered if you're looking for something that characterizes human existence as, inescapably characterizes human existence and is fundamental to it It's striking to me that you hit on the capacity to be wounded, which is what vulnerability means, right?
No, it's not what it means to me.
Well, good. So clarifying that would be helpful. So I'll just leave the question there and let you clarify that. The second part on the social side. Okay. I was really struck by the fact that you're looking for something very general and fundamental on the individual side. When you turn to the social, you speak of the state. And I'm a medievalist. I studied the Middle Ages.
Okay.
So it occurs to me, well, what you're calling the state has only been around for 400 or 500 years, I think. Something quite different was happening before that. So might it, at least to sort of clueless audiences like myself, might it be more effective to say something first about the responsibility of the society as a whole, and then step to why the state in particular is what should take up that?
Yeah, I often talk about it in terms of collective responsibility, but for me, the state, this is a good point, but even before we had the modern state, we still had the organization of coercive power, legitimated coercive power in a feudal system, or whatever system you have. A tribal system, you still have that. So when I think about the state, I'm thinking about that coercive. So there's other social arrangements that people can stand outside of, but when you think about that, the coercive, the lawgivers, whoever they are, however they're organized, the entity that can use coercive power, that has power over your body, has power over your property, that is the thing that none of us can stand outside of, actually. It can permit us to stand outside, or delude ourselves into thinking we stand outside of it in some ways, but as long as we're part of a society that's ruled by some form of law, rules, regulations, and norms, and they can be enforced by that authority, then that's what I call the state. But maybe I should be clearer about that, just a good start. As far as the capacity to be wounded, I mean so much more than that by vulnerability. And again, when Butler and others talk about that, and they talk about it in terms that are much more limited than what I'm thinking of. So again, I refer to the productive aspects. I think vulnerability is what builds societies too, civilizations, communities, relationships. So it's not, the capacity to be wounded is such a impoverished way of thinking about vulnerability. From
what it means. So.
What?
It's just that's the etymology of the word, so it strikes my ears that way.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's another word, passivity or.
I would like to. If you can think of another word. But again, the joy of, because when Butler talks about precarity, well, there's stability. Talk about weakness, well, there's strength. We talk about discrimination, well, there's an answer to lack of discrimination. But there's no not vulnerable. I mean, it's just, it is the human condition. So if you can think of another word that you can't put in this dichotomous pairing with something that isn't, then great.
Dependence, I think it's closer to it, actually.
Huh?
I think dependence is actually maybe closer, but.
There's independence.
But you can, I don't want to take everyone's time, but you could easily say, actually, there's no independence, right? Just as you say, there's no invulnerability.
Oh, but people don't, again, intuitively and experientially. I went through dependence. I know the arguments associated with that. But vulnerability, you look, I point out 9/11, Katrina, and the Great Recession of 2008, just in the first decade of the 21st century. That if you can think you're invulnerable, or anybody is invulnerable in the face of those, and not even you could throw in Paris, whatever you want to throw in, the whole notion, this is the age of the realization of our vulnerability, I think. And the problem is that it's being mobilized, or fear that's generated by the realization of our vulnerability is being mobilized for really horrible ends, and which are really evident after 9/11, but not only after 9/11. So, yeah. So another word, let me see. Was somebody else?
Just a follow-up on
I have a question about what your perspective has to say about some policies that European welfare states have developed to address the vulnerability of the dependent, derivative dependent situation. So the child allowance, for example, protects families against the idea that if you have 3 or more children, you wouldn't be able to support them. But at the same time, it subsidizes, maybe might encourage some women to give up their careers and focus on the home and become vulnerable in other ways because they have interrupted their career. So I'm wondering, when you have policies that address one kind of dependent, derivative dependence, but might create some other kinds of vulnerability, how do you arbitrate?
Again, they don't become vulnerable in other ways. Vulnerability is a universal concept of the human condition. It is the human condition, so you do not become vulnerable and they're not creating vulnerability. Interestingly, Sweden, there's a vulnerability project in Sweden, and they actually gave me an honorary doctorate based on the vulnerability theory, and they have a project there that's now fully underway. Leeds University in the UK wants to become the European home for vulnerability theory at this point, and there was recently a philosopher actually hired at UC Dublin in vulnerability theory. So the European welfare state, there's also a project, I had the chairwoman of the Convention on the Rights of the Child come to learn about vulnerability theory and spend time at Emory. So the whole notion that the European welfare state does not need vulnerability is wrong. They recognize that they need it. They recognize that they need it more than Americans recognize that we need it. Interestingly enough, I think it's really fascinating. So those supports, but those supports that are given, the state's responsiveness to dependency that we see in the welfare state is under attack, first of all. But secondly, I see nothing wrong with the notion that in fact you would have a state that's responsive to vulnerability, responsive to dependency, that would allow someone, male or female, to decide that they're willing to spend more time with their children. I think that's a good thing. And in fact, when you read about robotics, I think we should all better figure out how we can have a state that's responsive when there isn't in fact enough work to go around. So Americans tend to think that work is the primary relationship. I think a vulnerability analysis would question that, whether that in fact should be true.
But if you've got a labor market that really punishes people who interrupt their careers, are you really serving the long run offsetting vulnerability goal?
Well, again,
by doing that?
that's why the state has a responsibility to address those social identities, those social relationships. So what does it mean to be an employee and versus an employer? And what does the state have to say about regulating that relationship in a way that is more just and fairer to employees? Because now it's skewed heavily in favor of employers. Also, what does the state have to say about the intersection between my role as employee and my role as parent? The state should have to assume some responsibility for ensuring that those roles are not inherently in conflict, that they're not impossible to perform well together. So, that's the role I see for the responsive state. That is a role that the European states have historically performed better than we do. But again, under attack. It's really, really interesting.
How can constitutional law accommodate vulnerability theory? So it seems like so much of how our Constitution, at least is interpreted, is about negative rights. Stay out of people's lives, don't discriminate, don't prohibit people from privately accessing opportunities, but there's no positive duty to provide education, healthcare, food, and the like. So,
well, that's what I meant about redefining. So cases like de-shaming and other cases, that's what I meant about trying to define what is a constitutional injury. An injury, a violation of the state of the social terms of the social contract. But in order to get there, you really have to think seriously about what is the social contract. And so we have a social contract that envisions this autonomous, liberal, independent subject, right, an adult, fully functioning subject. And what I'm arguing is that we have to include the vulnerable subject as in contract with the state in terms of the social contract, so that a failure to respond to vulnerability would then be viewed as a constitutional injury. That, again, we're not there yet, but at least we can start to think about that and claiming that. But more importantly, I think, or more realistically, at this point, I pick up on Justice Stevens and others have developed this notion of legislative due process, judicial review of legislative due process. And it's kind of an interesting concept that's also reflected in some institutional arrangements in Europe. For example, in the UK, they have these commissions on children and youth, and their sole task, they're publicly funded, but their sole task is to define the implications for children and youth of any proposed legislation, and to use university and other resources, NGOs and so forth, to produce reports that then become part of a political process. So that the legislation is informed by this realization that this is going to be the impact on children and youth. And what I could see are, and again, you can see this starting like in the progressive era, when progressive politics started at local and state levels, putting in those kinds of commissions to look at what are the implications in terms of vulnerability, who's privileged, who's disadvantaged, bringing that information into the legislative process. And then the court's role in that context is to look to see that the legislature actually considered all of those other factors, that it actually took that in as part of their deliberative process. Not that the result is the right one. Again, vulnerability doesn't answer the question of which way we should go, but what it hopefully can do is inform the political structure and the political nature of the decisions that are made. Yeah.
So the language of vulnerability and claims of vulnerability get used in so many ways, and I can think of ways that they get used that the people in this room probably would frown at. I mean, some of the, in the 80s, mistaken impressions of AIDS transmission that lead to people being ostracized from their schools, or Syrian refugees are going, I'm vulnerable to the terrorism that's going to come from them, or transgender equality bills are making women vulnerable to men going in women's bathrooms. And you hear claims that you just like, oh, how are people possibly arguing that? But they couch it in terms of vulnerability in ways that really don't fit in at all with anything that I would imagine you were on board with at all. And so how do you put vulnerability and dependency and all of those languages at the center of sort of the public consciousness in the way that really you need to bring about the change that you want without having it kind of trickle down those channels that lead to even more oppression and ostracism?
So I think those examples, and there are lots of examples of that, are really also indicate the power of the concept. And so I think it's really important that we not allow that the concept of vulnerability to be misused, to be used for those ends, and in fact it is. I mean, I mentioned what happened after 9/11 with the notions of, well, we're vulnerable, therefore let's do away with civil liberties, let's do away with all this other stuff. And let's incidentally have a war. But this is why I think it's really important that this be part of the academic project. And it's really important why, when I said that we focus on corporate law and we focus on finance law and we focus on those institutional arrangements, because one way to understand those laws is that they are in fact enacted in appreciation of the vulnerability of those institutions. So that if you look at, so if we start to talk about vulnerability that way, it takes a very different cast. So we have laws that rescued the financial institution in 2000, after 2008, but did not rescue the individual mortgage holders, right? But the mortgage crisis that was created by those financial institutions, the law responded to the vulnerability that those organizations have to market and to crashing and so forth and so on, but not to the vulnerability of individuals. So that, again, to only focus on the vulnerability as a weakness, vulnerability as victimization, vulnerability in that way allows that kind of misuse, the appropriation and the power behind the concept to be used for, by the forces of evil. For want of a better term. Yeah.
Do you have any wisdom for us in thinking about how we might rebalance the power that's in educational relationships? And I can go to your icon, show the teacher and student. I often find myself in teaching graduate students to teach, where they all want to go headlong into, I have a democratic classroom with big points for everyone having an equal voice. And I'm saying, that's good, but also don't forget to teach them something. That authority is also a good thing, and we don't want to just disable authority. But so that's one part of what. But the other part is that of course the institutions seem to have been legally recognized as places that can breed and protect certain kinds of violence, and sexual violence is important among those. So the law's actually been pretty smart in putting some things together to try to make a more sustainable situation, a more resilient situation for women in institutions, for instance. One of the ways that this series of lectures grew up at the University of Virginia is a general concern with thinking about how to try to monitor the environment and increase equity in relationships among the genders, which grow out, we all have a sneaking suspicion, or maybe a vocal one, grow out of situations like there being a lot of young men together controlling the alcohol, right, or something like that. So I just wondered if you had any, if you thought into the university as an institution with regard to these kinds of current and inevitable, seemingly inevitable, and long-standing questions about sexual violence and headedness and
So I am the editor of a series with Ashgate. Now Ashgate's been taken over, so it's now whatever it is. But on gender and culture and law and society, or something like that. I forget what it's called. But we just commissioned a book that looks at vulnerability in the context of sexual violence on campus. So it does a whole vulnerability, and I'll be glad to send you that perspective if you're interested. But I do think that a vulnerability analysis requires a really sustained and deep look at the current organization of educational institutions. One aspect of that was done by my colleague Ben Reese, who does some work on disability, and also he's an English professor. When after the, I think it was West Virginia shooting on campus, and one of the things that